Today's lesson is Teens' Brains Aged Faster During Lockdowns. Hi, everybody. I'm Roger.
And I'm Helen.
And again, we're going to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic, as if we haven't talked about that enough over the past 2 or 3 years. And today we're talking about something that has to do with education and how it was handled during the pandemic. Remember, for a period of time, their schools were closed and people had to study at home. And, of course, this had an effect on people. Did they learn as well as they would have learned if they had gone to school? Well, according to our article, they probably did not.
Yes, the lockdown during the pandemic had a huge impact on teenagers, not only for their social lives, but also for the way in which their brains developed. As we know, teenagers' brains are still in the phase of development. It's actually a very critical stage of development for human beings, those teenage years when the brain is supposed to absorb new information, be stimulated by experiences and new knowledge. Well, that was all affected by the pandemic. And today we're going to look at exactly how the teenage brain has been affected by the pandemic.
Let's take a look, everybody. Let's begin our lesson by listening to the first part, and we'll come back to break it down for you.
Teens' brains aged faster during lockdowns. The COVID-19 pandemic was intensely stressful for many people, with large numbers isolated from regular social activity for long periods during lockdowns. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, and a recent study from the US suggests that those dull days of isolation had a worrying impact on young people. Specifically, the brains of teenagers appear to have aged faster than normal during lockdown life.
大家好，第一部分我们可以看到副词 intensely。它的意思是极度或是强烈的。例如 The athletes competed intensely for the gold medal. 运动员们为了争夺金牌展开了激烈的竞争。又或者说 Oliver has been intensely interested in basketball ever since he was a teenager. Oliver 从青少年时期就对篮球有浓厚的兴趣。另外，这个字去掉字尾 ly 就会变成形容词 intense， 指的是激烈的或是极度的意思。例如 The movie had an intense chase scene at the end. 这部电影的结尾有激烈的追逐场面。再举一个例子 Skydiving is a very intense experience. 高空跳伞是种非常激烈的体验。再来，我们介绍动词 isolate， 它指的是孤立、隔离或是分离。例如 John isolated himself in his room and won't talk to anyone. John 把自己关在房间里，不跟任何人说话。或者 The island's remote location isolated it from the rest of the world. 这个岛屿偏远的位置使它与世隔绝。另外，补充这个字的名词 isolation， isolation, isolation。举例来说 After Glenn became famous, he also developed a deep sense of isolation. 在 Glenn 成名后，他也开始感受到深刻的孤独感。再看一个例子Peter lived a life of isolation and never spoke to anybody. Peter 过着与世隔绝的生活，从不与人交谈。
So the title of today's lesson is Teens' Brains Aged Faster During Lockdowns. Now, lockdown is a word that has often been associated with the pandemic, with COVID-19. What the word actually refers to is a time when people are restricted from accessing certain services. When they have to stay home, they can't go to work, they can't go to school. Sometimes they can't even go shopping, or the time that they are able to go out and go shopping for food is restricted. So that's an example of a lockdown.
Kind of interesting. Of course, we had lockdowns here in Taiwan, but I wasn't really so affected by that. My work was one I could still do without being in contact with other people, so I still went to work as usual during that time, but I enjoyed it because there weren't that many people on the streets and traffic was much more smooth to get through. But of course, I should still remember that lots of kids who used to go to school and had to study at home were affected by this pandemic, and indeed, we do have some evidence that that brains aged faster for teenagers during the lockdowns of the pandemic. Now, here in the first paragraph, it says, the COVID-19 pandemic was intensely stressful for many people, with large numbers isolated from regular social activity for long periods of time during lockdowns. So, of course, we've got this pandemic, which we've talked about so many times. I think most of us are sick and tired of hearing about the pandemic, but it still has its after effects that we need to talk about. And it was intensely stressful for lots of people. If something's stressful, of course, it causes a lot of pressure. It causes a lot of stress. And if something is intensely stressful, that means it is very, very, very much stressful. Intense means to a high degree or at high intensity, basically, I could also say. Like, for example, sometimes if you want to learn a language fast, you can take intensive courses. Maybe your company is going to send you to Russia and you need to learn Russian really fast. Well, you might take an intensive Russian course.
Right. So another word for intensely would be extremely. So this period of the pandemic was intensely or extremely stressful for a lot of people because a lot of people were isolated from regular social activity for long periods of time. To be isolated means to be kept away from other people, to be kept alone in a place. Sometimes you could be isolated when you are living in a country and you feel like you don't have anybody living close to you, so you feel isolated. Some of us might even feel isolated when we're living in a big city with a lot of neighbors, a lot of people around us. So the feeling of isolated or being isolated could also refer to a feeling that you have that's not necessarily reflective of the physical situation.
Right, so lots of people had to stay away from their friends and from their classmates. They were isolated from school and social activities for long periods of time, and time seemed to slow to a crawl. And a recent study from the U.S. suggests that these dull days of isolation had a worrying impact on young people. So here it says time seemed to slow to a crawl. Crawling is when you walk on the ground with four limbs with your legs and your hands, like babies crawl before they learn how to walk. And of course, we've got alligators and other kinds of reptiles who crawl across the ground. And that's usually considered a very slow movement. So if things slow to a crawl, that means they slow down to a high degree. Like during rush hour, traffic can slow to a crawl, and you wonder if you're ever going to get home.
Yes, so time seemed to go by much slower. It seemed to slow to a crawl during the pandemic. And recent studies suggest that those dull days when time seemed to slow to a crawl and every day was boring because you were at home all the time, you couldn't interact with your friends, you couldn't go out, that all of this had a worrying impact on young people.
Exactly. So here we've got those days of isolation, and that's a noun here having to do with to isolate. The verb is to isolate, to make something far away from other people or other places. But isolation is the process or the situation in which you are isolated from other people or things. Isolation. And yes, indeed, these days of isolation were quite dull. They were boring. And of course, that had a negative effect on young people. It's worrying. It's something that we should worry about. Well, what are we talking about? Well, specifically, to tell you the details, the brains of teenagers appear to have aged faster than normal during lockdown life. So, of course, if your brain ages, that means it gets older. And maybe when you get older physically with your body, your brain will be older than your body, and maybe you'll start to suffer from Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease or dementia.
So when we say that these brains are aging faster than normal, we're not saying that teenagers are getting smarter faster. It just means that the physical brain is getting older than normal.
Exactly, and I believe there were some other negative effects in terms of education. I think math skills went down in the United States along with other skills as well. So it certainly was not beneficial for people to be isolated at home taking classes online. Okay, that brings us to the end of the first part of our lesson for today. Let's go on to talk about the second part. We'll listen to it first.
A study conducted in California compared the brains of two groups of teenagers. One group underwent MRI scans between 2016 and 2019, while the second was scanned between 2020 and 2022, after pandemic lockdowns began. After the second group was isolated in their homes for about 10 months, their brains appeared to be 3 years older, on average, than the brains of those in the first group.
第二部分我们看到动词 undergo， 它的意思是经历或是遭受。举例来说 Some parts of the museum are closed as they are undergoing repairs. 那座博物馆的部分区域关闭，因为他们正在进行维修。又或者说 Rita underwent multiple blood tests. Rita 接受了多种血液检测。接下来我们介绍名词 scan， 它的意思是身体的扫描检查。例如Russell had to undergo a brain scan to determine the extent of the injury. Russell 必须接受脑部扫描，以确定受伤的程度。又或者说 The doctor is looking at a scan of the patient's thigh bone to see if it's broken. 该医生正在检查那位病人的大腿骨扫描图，好看他是否骨折。
So how did scientists discover that teenage brains were aging faster? Well, a study was conducted in California, and this study compared the brains of two groups of teenagers. One group underwent MRI scans between 2016 and 2019, while the second was scanned between 2020 and 2022 after pandemic lockdowns began. So, in other words, in this study, some scientists in California compared brain scans of two groups of teenagers. One group of teenagers had their brain scanned, or these MRI scans were done before the pandemic. So it was done over 3 years from 2016 to 2019. In the second group, the scans were done during the pandemic from 2020 to 2022. And the scientists compared the two groups of scans.
Right, so here we've got the word underwent, and that is the past tense of the verb undergo, which means something happens to you, you go through a certain process. Like, for example, if you have a tumor, you might undergo surgery to have it removed. And in this case, a group of teenagers underwent those MRI scans between a certain period of time. A scan is the process in which something is scanned. Here, scan is being used as a noun. And we've got the second group of teenagers. They were scanned between 2020 and 2022 after pandemic lockdowns began. So we've got two groups of teenagers, one who had scans pretty much before the pandemic, and then we've got scans of teenagers that were done during the pandemic.
After the second group was isolated in their homes for about 10 months, their brains appeared to be 3 years older on average than the brains of those in the first group.
Okay, so that shows us that the isolation they had to undergo during the pandemic did have a negative effect on their brains. Of course, teenagers want to be more mature and they want to think that they know a lot more than other people. So maybe it sounds good that their brains aged 3 years. They could be considered adults, perhaps, but I think they're implying that this is a negative result. Their brains are 3 years older and thus probably not as able to absorb new information like they could before. Okay, that brings us to the end of the second part of our lesson for today. Let's move on now to the third part, and we'll listen first.
The study's authors believe that increased anxiety and depression were responsible for speeding up the aging of the second group's brains, as that group reported higher rates of such mental difficulties than the pre-pandemic group. The study's findings have sparked concern because such accelerated brain development in young people is typically associated with trauma and adversity. In addition, such rapid changes are often correlated with long-term mental health problems and increased risk of poor health later in life.
第三部分我们看到单字 depression， 它是名词，指的是忧郁、沮丧或是忧郁症。例如Jamal went through a period of depression in his 20s. Jamal 20多岁时经历一段忧郁期。或是 Unable to leave his apartment for weeks, Doug started showing signs of depression. 几个星期不能离开公寓， Doug 开始出现忧郁的迹象。最后介绍一个动词 spark， 这个字有引发、触发或是引起的意思。例如 My older brother sparked my interest in science. 我哥哥激起我对科学的兴趣。或是 The popular commercial sparked demand for the product. 这个受欢迎的广告刺激了对此产品的需求。
Now we're going to look at why did teenagers' brains age so much faster during lockdown. Well, the study's authors believe that increased anxiety and depression were responsible for speeding up the aging of the second group's brains, as that group reported higher rates of such mental difficulties than the pre-pandemic group. So, in other words, the teenagers who underwent lockdown and lived through the pandemic also experienced increased anxiety and depression. Depression is a feeling of being very, very sad. All of us feel sad every once in a while, but depression is something that's serious, that's more serious than just a brief spell of sadness. Depression usually lasts longer than just a brief spell of sadness, and a lot of teenagers during the lockdown period experienced anxiety, feeling nervous and feeling unhappy about things, and depression, which is a feeling of sadness. And according to these scientists, these feelings were responsible for speeding up or making the aging of the second group's brains faster than normal.
Right, to speed up means to increase your speed, like a lot of people do when they see the light ahead turning red. It turns yellow. I don't want to stop, so they speed up in order to catch that yellow light before it turns red. We don't advise you to do that, but that's just an example of the verb phrase to speed up. And yes, indeed, that group reported higher rates of such mental difficulties than the pre-pandemic group. So yes, the teenagers who had to undergo lockdowns did experience depression and anxiety, and that sped up their brain's aging process. And they had higher rates of mental difficulties than those who had those scans before the pandemic.
That's right. So the study's findings have sparked concern because such accelerated brain development in young people is typically associated with trauma and adversity. In other words, why is the fact that teenagers' brains aged faster during the pandemic a cause for worry? Well, the study's findings have sparked concern. Findings here refers to the information that was gathered from the study. So the discovery or the opinions that scientists form after they conducted the study, these are called findings. So these findings have sparked concern. When you spark something or when something sparks something else, it makes that other thing happen. It causes a reaction. So I could say, for instance, that a protest was sparked by these unfair laws. Here, these findings have sparked concern or worry because such accelerated brain development in young people is typically associated with trauma and adversity. Accelerated here means to go faster, to happen at a faster rate. And in this case, the development of teenagers' brains were happening at a faster rate.
Right, and here we've got trauma. That is a very disturbing experience that you might have, some kind of injury, or maybe you saw something terrible happen. I could say Ben experienced extreme trauma when he saw the dog getting run over by a large truck on the freeway. It was quite distressing to him. He had nightmares about it. He experienced trauma. And also we've got the word adversity here. If something's adverse, that means that it is difficult to deal with. It's kind of misfortunate. It's not fortunate. And so if you deal with adversity, you're just dealing with a very stressful situation.
Right. And a word about the word trauma here. Trauma has traditionally been used for referring to bad experiences that shock you. So we talk about soldiers experiencing trauma because they saw a lot of ugly things during the war. They saw blood, people getting killed. Or if you see something very tragic happen, you might have trauma because of it. But these days, trauma is also being used for other situations that are lighter and not as serious as the situations that were normally, traditionally associated with the word trauma.
Indeed. So, yes, they experienced trauma and adversity during the pandemic. And in addition, such rapid changes are often correlated with long-term mental health problems and increased risk of poor health later in life. So here we've got the word correlated, and that is from the verb to correlate, which means to have a relationship with, to be related to each other. We could say that obesity rates in the United States are correlated with high consumption of junk food. Because they eat so much junk food, they get really fat. So here, of course, these rapid changes are often correlated, or they often have a direct result in terms of having long-term mental health problems. In other words, they cause those long-term health problems. And of course, you're going to have an increased risk of poor health later in life. Okay, that brings us to the end of our explanation for today. Let's listen to Hanny now.
"各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文第3部分一开始提到，这项研究的作者们认为焦虑和忧郁增加是加速第二组大脑老化的原因。那他用到 increased anxiety and depression were responsible for 去表达说焦虑和忧郁增加是什么什么的原因。那这边我们就来整理一下 be responsible for的相关用法。首先第一个呢，我们可以用这个用法来表达负责什么，掌管什么什么，对什么负有全责。那它不带有负面语义，像是 Who's responsible for organizing the event this year? 今年是谁负责筹划那场活动呢？好，那第二个用法呢，可以用来表达对什么是负有责任的，像是可能是对某个意外啊、过错、罪行等等负有责任，这时候就带有负面语义咯。例如 The bus driver was responsible for the accident. 那位公车司机要对这起意外事故负责。那么第三个呢，可以表达造成、导致，这就像课文的用法，可以用来表达是什么什么的原因。举例来说 A lightning strike was responsible for the fire. 雷击是造成那场火灾的原因。好，那么同样在课文第3部分有一句则提到，年轻人这种加速的大脑发育通常与精神创伤和困境有关。那文中是用到 adversity 这个名词来表达逆境、困境或是厄运。那它的形容词是 adverse 或是念作 adverse A-D-V-E-R-S-E。 那我们来学一下它的字首字根，看到 V-E-R-S或者是 VERT 这一类字根的意思就是 turn 就是转动或是有翻转变动的意思。那么带有这一类字根的字呢，大多含有改变原状的语义。在 adverse 这个字当中呢，它的字首 AD 表示 toward 朝向，那么字根 VERSE 表示 turn， 合在一起 adverse 就有 turn toward 也就是转向什么什么的意思。好，那同学们就可以想象啦，跟我们友好、对我们有利的事物会在同一阵线，跟我们站在同一边。那我们要转向迎头面对的，则是不好的、不利的事物。用这个方式，也许可以联想到 adverse， 它是形容不利的、有害的或是负面的。那我们也补充几个有这类字根的单字。第一个是 divert， 它可以念作 divert 或者是 divert， 它的字首 di 有分离的意思，或者是从什么什么。那么字根 vert 表示转，我们就可以用转移到旁边去联想到 divert 或是 divert， 它具有使转向、使改道或者是转移，像是转移注意力的这种意思。好，那么第二个补充的是 conversation， 它的字首 con 表示一起或是强调，那么字根 vers 表示转 ，ation 则是名词字尾。那么在聊天的时候啊，我们讲话不是会轮来轮去会有互动吗？我们就可以用强调双方有互动才能对话的方式去联想 conversation 就表示交谈、对话或对谈。好，以上是今天重点整理，我们来回顾今天的单字吧。
Intensely. The children were intensely excited to meet Santa Claus. Isolate. The famous prisoner was isolated from the other prisoners for his own protection. Undergo. The restaurant underwent a redesign before its grand opening. Scan. The scan revealed that the patient's leg was broken in 2 places. Depression. The doctor advised Mrs. Carson that regular exercise could help reduce her depression. Spark. The bank's sudden failure sparked an economic crisis. Trauma. The trauma of the war affected the soldiers' mental health for years.
Discussion starter starts now!
And now, here's our discussion starter. And the question is, do you think pandemic shutdowns negatively impacted your life?
I don't think that pandemic shutdowns negatively impacted me, considering that I'm not a teenager and I don't have the same needs as teenagers do. In fact, I think I thrived during lockdowns because I had the time to learn new things, take online courses, and so on.
Well, personally, the pandemic shutdowns affected my social life because we were supposed to stay away from each other. So I couldn't go over to Joe's house to talk with him, or I couldn't get together with Jose and talk about life in Paraguay. We just couldn't do that. We were supposed to stay apart from each other, so I spent a lot of time playing video games at home.
Well, everyone, today's article has come to an end, and I sure hope you enjoy reading along with us. I am Helen.
I am Roger.
See you next time.